Right, settle in, grab yourself a drink. Go on, I'll wait. Because tonight, we're not just talking about a bad film. Oh no, that's too simple. Any idiot with a camera and a rich uncle can make a bad film. We're talking about something else entirely. We're talking about a cinematic nervous breakdown. A multi-million-dollar, star-studded, psychedelic catastrophe that wasn't so much directed as it was unleashed. We're talking about the 1967 production of Casino Royale. Here's the thing. They had James Bond, they had a mountain of cash, and they had half of Hollywood. And what did they make? A Dog's Dinner so confusing, so utterly mental, it makes no sense at all. They weren't making a film, they were having a breakdown and pointing a camera at it. This isn't a story about movie making, it's a cautionary tale about what happens when ego, money, and a complete and utter absence of a plan get thrown into a blender and the lid flies off. This is the story of a film made by a committee of lunatics. So, how does a mess this grand even begin? Well, like all the best disasters, it starts with a simple problem of ownership. A fella named Charles K. Feldman, a big shot Hollywood producer, had a golden ticket. See, back in the 50s, before Sean Connery ever slipped on a tuxedo, Feldman had bought the film rights to Ian Fleming's very first Bond novel, Casino Royale. Simple enough, right? Except by the mid-60s, two other fellas, Cubby Broccoli and Harry Saltzman, had cornered the market. Their company, Eon Productions, had the rights to all the other Bond books, and their films, starting with Dr. No, were printing money. They'd turned James Bond into a global phenomenon. Feldman, sitting on his one little book, went to them, cap in hand. "Hey lads," he says, "how about we team up? We can make the definitive Bond." And Broccoli and Saltzman, looking at the mountains of cash they were already making, essentially told him to sod off. Big mistake. For everyone. Because Feldman, bless his arrogant heart, wasn't the kind of fella to just walk away. He had a philosophy, a very dangerous one in Hollywood. If you can't join him, mock him. He couldn't make a real Bond movie, so he decided he was going to make the biggest, most spectacular, most expensive joke of a Bond movie ever conceived. He'd just come off a film called What's New Pussycat. It was a shambles of a production, famous for its script being rewritten every day by its star, Woody Allen. It was chaotic, overstuffed with cameos, and made absolutely no sense. And it was a massive hit. And there, right there, is the poison seed. Feldman learned the worst lesson a producer can possibly learn, that chaos sells. He thought, right, I'll do that again, but this time with James Bond. He decided to make a satirical spoof, a comedy. He wasn't gonna have one James Bond, he was gonna have all the James Bonds. He wasn't gonna have one or two big stars. He was going to empty the phone book. The plan wasn't to make a movie, the plan was to throw a massive decadent party and film the wreckage. So, with a budget that started at a healthy 6 million, that's about 50 million today, and trust me, it didn't stop there. Feldman started collecting his cast. First, he needed his real Sir James Bond, not the thuggish government killer Connery was playing. No, he wanted a proper English gentleman. He went to David Niven. Niven was actually Ian Fleming's original choice for the role, a bit of trivia that gave the whole thing a sliver of legitimacy. Niven's Bond would be retired, a stammering, chaste legend who's coaxed back into service to clean up the mess left by his oversexed namesake. Well, it sounds like an idea anyway. Then, for the villain Le Chiffre, Feldman needed someone with real gravity, someone huge, so he got Orson Welles, the genius behind Citizen Kane, a man with an ego so vast it had its own gravitational pull. Welles wasn't just an actor, he was a force of nature who thought most directors were traffic cops, and he was the only one who knew how to drive. Keep him in mind. He's important. Then, to write the thing, or at least part of the thing, he brought in the best. Ben Hecht, Billy Wilder, Terry Southern, serious talent. But the problem with having a dozen brilliant writers is you end up with a dozen brilliant and completely different ideas. The script was never a script, it was a collection of suggestions. A pile of loose pages that changed depending on who was in the room. And then came the star, the man who was supposed to be the anchor, the comedy centerpiece. the man who would almost single-handedly detonate the entire production, Peter Sellers. Ah, Peter Sellers, a genius, a comedic god, and by all accounts, a profoundly troubled and difficult man. In the mid-60s, he was one of the biggest stars in the world. Feldman didn't just want him, he needed him. He cast Sellers as Evelyn Tremble, a baccarat expert recruited to pose as James Bond and beat Le Chiffre at the tables. Sellers saw this as his chance. He didn't want to be a clown in a silly spoof. He wanted to be the real James Bond. He wanted to play it cool, suave, sexy. He wanted to out-Bond Sean Connery. He came to the set with his own ideas, his own dialogue, and an attitude that could curdle milk from 100 paces. So now we have the players. A gentleman Bond, a genius director villain with a titanic ego, and a comedy star who desperately wants to be a romantic lead. What could possibly go wrong? Oh, I forgot one little detail. The directors. Plural. Feldman, in his infinite wisdom, didn't hire a director, he hired 5. John Huston, a Hollywood legend. Ken Hughes, Val Guest, Robert Parrish, Joseph McGrath. Each was given a different segment of the non-existent script to shoot with different actors, sometimes on different continents. The thinking was, well, there was no thinking. It was pure, unadulterated madness. It's like deciding to build a house by giving 5 different architects 5 different blueprints and telling them all to start at once. The result wasn't a house, it was an asylum, and the 2 head inmates were about to have their first therapy session. The heart of the film, the central sequence, was supposed to be the confrontation between Evelyn Tremble Sellers and Le Chiffre over a game of baccarat in the Casino Royale. This was it. The comedic superstar versus the cinematic legend. It should have been movie magic. It was a declaration of war. The trouble started immediately. Sellers, deeply insecure and desperate to be taken seriously as a romantic hero, was utterly cripplingly intimidated by Orson Welles. Welles, for his part, saw Sellers not as a fellow artist, but as an amateur, a trivial man he once called him. He had no time for Sellers' method acting nonsense. Their very first day on set together, Sellers arrived to find Welles performing magic tricks for the crew. Welles, you see, was an accomplished magician and he loved an audience. Sellers saw this as Welles deliberately stealing his spotlight, undermining him before a single frame was shot. He became convinced Welles was trying to psych him out. It got petty, and it got petty fast. There was a story about Sellers complaining that Welles's presence was throwing off his aura. He demanded that a psychic be brought to the set to cleanse the studio of Welles's bad energy. Then there was the height issue. Sellers was not a tall man. Welles was, well, he was Orson Welles. He was huge. Sellers became obsessed with the idea that Welles was trying to make him look small on camera. He demanded he be given a higher chair, that the camera angles be adjusted to make him appear taller. It all came to a head when they were supposed to shoot their big 2-shot scene, facing each other across the baccarat table. The tension was so thick you could cut it with a knife. After a few takes, Sellers just refused. He declared he would not, could not work in the same room as Orson Welles. Think about that. The 2 main actors in the movie's central scene refused to be filmed together. The director, Joseph McGrath, was tearing his hair out. How do you shoot a conversation between 2 people who won't be in the same room? The answer was, you don't. They shot it like a hostage negotiation. They'd film all of Welles's lines, looking over the shoulder of a stand-in who was pretending to be Sellers. Then they'd kick Welles out, bring Sellers in, and film all of his lines looking over the shoulder of a different fella pretending to be Welles. It's madness! The entire emotional core of the film is 2 fellas acting at a cardboard cutout of the other. But it gets worse. Sellers' behaviour became more and more erratic. He would lock himself in his trailer for hours. He would rewrite his scenes on the spot. He started wearing bizarre disguises to the set, a Scottish accent one day, a Napoleon costume the next. He punched his friend, the director, in a fit of rage, and then, one day, he just didn't show up. He got on a plane and left. He walked off the most expensive movie in production and just vanished. He hadn't finished his scenes. His character's story had no ending. He just quit. The star of the movie, the linchpin of the whole ridiculous enterprise, was gone. Feldman and the directors were left with a half-finished performance and a gaping hole in their story. Their grand plan had collapsed into a black hole of ego. They had no choice but to try and stitch a movie together out of the wreckage Sellers had left behind. With Sellers gone, the production descended from mere chaos into a full-blown free-for-all. There was no script, no star, and no hope of making a coherent film. So they did the only thing they could. They doubled down on the madness. If a scene wasn't working, they'd just write a new one. If a part of the plot made no sense, they'd hire another star for a cameo to distract everyone. William Holden, Charles Boyer, John Huston himself, they just kept throwing famous faces at the screen, hoping it would hide the fact that nothing connected to anything else. Woody Allen, who was also cast in the film as Bond's neurotic nephew, Jimmy Bond, saw the writing on the wall. He basically hijacked his own part of the movie. He'd take the script pages they gave him, throw them in the bin, and just write his own stuff, turning his character into a rambling, paranoid mess who ends up being the secret supervillain Dr. Noah. His entire subplot feels like it was beamed in from a different universe because, well, it was. The different directors were all off doing their own thing. John Huston shot this long rambling sequence in a Scottish castle that felt like a parody of a different movie entirely. Another director was filming a bizarre German expressionist sequence in a spy school. Another was doing a slapstick chase scene. None of them were talking to each other. They were all making their own little movies. The budget, which had started at 6 million, soared. 8 million, 10 million. It finally topped out at over 12 million, more than double the cost of Sean Connery's You Only Live Twice, which was being made at the same time. They were spending a fortune on a film that had no ending and no story. Eventually, the studio realized they were about to have the world's most expensive home movie on their hands. They brought in another director, Val Guest, not to direct but to perform surgery. His job was to take the miles of disconnected, contradictory footage that the other 5 directors had shot and somehow, by some miracle, stitch it into something that looked like a movie. Guest watched everything they had, the Niven stuff, the half-finished Sellers performance, the Woody Allen fever dream, the cameos, the car chases, and he must have thought, what in God's name am I supposed to do with this? It was Guest who came up with the brilliant idea that supposedly ties it all together. He decided that the reason everything is so disjointed is because there isn't one James Bond. There are lots of James Bonds. MI6 has decided to confuse the enemy by naming a bunch of different agents, James Bond 007. It was a desperate, last-ditch attempt to put a frame around a picture that was just a splash of paint on the floor. It was an excuse, a narrative band-aid slapped over a gaping chest wound. It explains why nothing makes sense by institutionalizing the nonsense. The grand finale he concocted is maybe one of the most baffling sequences ever put to film. It involves the U.S. cavalry, French legionnaires, and cowboys fighting in a casino, Woody Allen swallowing a tiny atomic bomb, and the entire casino being blown up and lifted into the air by a flying saucer, with all the characters ascending to heaven as angels. I am not making that up. That is the actual ending. It's what happens when you have a deadline and no pages left to read. You just throw everything at the wall. Casino Royale was finally released in 1967, and the critics, well, they sharpened their knives. They called it a monumental mess, incoherent, a film with no discipline, no style, and no substance. They saw it for exactly what it was, a bloated, self-indulgent train wreck. But here's the final, most baffling twist in this whole sorry tale. It made money. Yup. All that chaos, all that ego, all that wasted money, and the public, drawn in by the magic of the Bond name and the sheer number of stars on the poster, actually went to see it. It was one of the highest grossing films of the year. But money isn't everything. Its reputation was, and still is, in the gutter. It stands as a perfect monument to Hollywood hubris. It's the ultimate example of a film with no captain, a ship adrift in a sea of bad ideas. It proves that you can have all the money in the world, the most famous character, the biggest stars, the most talented writers, and if you don't have a story, if you don't have a singular vision, a plan, all you're gonna make is noise. Expensive, glorious, fascinating noise. So the next time you see a movie that feels like it was made by a committee, that's got too many stars and not enough sense, you can raise a glass to Casino Royale. The film that proved that if you give a room full of monkeys enough money and enough time, they won't write Shakespeare, they'll just build a multi-million-dollar flying saucer and blow themselves up. And you can't say that's not entertaining.